heck did that happen?
Yeah, well, sometimes music doesn't work out. All right. Although I still play. I think I told you recently, I play in a New Orleans style street band that does social and community events.
Wow.
A lot of fun.
Well, what was your path to, how did you end up in this field, let alone create the field?
Well, it's a little embarrassing to hear because it's not, it sounds a lot better when Bob makes it than what it really is. But the way I got started was really kind of funny. I mean, it wasn't very funny at the time, but which was, I went to college at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And in my sophomore year, because it was always hard to find a place to live, Madison had a number of cooperative housing, both student cooperative housing and non-student cooperative housing. And so as I was looking for a place, I found a place to live in one of the cooperatives, and one of my good friends also was there. And they also had a sort of regional-wide organization of cooperatives that met on a regular basis that included housing co-ops, food co-ops, they had a co-op garage. I mean, it's hard to believe now, but at one point in time, Wisconsin was a very progressive state. And I look back now and I say, like, what happened? How could this be? And I don't get into it, they have like a terrible governor. It makes our governor here look like the most progressive governor in the country. So but anyhow, I digress. So one of the opportunities, if you're a co-op, is that on a circulating basis, the board was comprised of members from each of the co-op. So that was our co-op's year, and there was a meeting of the co-op, and the person who was facilitating the meeting said, it's our turn to have a member of the board of the Madison Community Cooperative. And so anyone want to do it? And like nobody raised their hand or anything. And then I don't know how it happened. It's sort of like, one of those old cartoons that you see where there's a dog who's a sergeant and there's all these other dogs lined up. And he says, I want one volunteer, and then like everybody else takes one step backwards. So you're the only person standing. So long story short, I ended up on the board. At that time, I think I was like 19 years old, and didn't even know what a board did. I'm still not sure. and after serving on the board for a year, the person who was the executive director took another job, one that actually paid real money, and so they needed an interim director. For some reason, again, I think it was maybe everybody's taking one step back. I ended up as the interim director, and one of the things I was really interested in doing is I had done, saw what we were paying, and it was really pretty low. And the housing market was like you could really live pretty cheaply if you lived in a cooperative. What I also saw at that time is that real estate was really cheap. I mean, it was so out of line with rents at that time. Hard to believe now, but what we were paying in rents could have bought the house in a couple of years. And when I did the numbers, I thought, wow, we should be buying up property. And so I said to the board, I said, we should have a plan where we let's buy up as much property as we possibly can. Convert it all to cooperatively owned housing. These, by the way, actually, for the most part, weren't real cooperatives. They were, Madison Community Cooperative was a nonprofit, so the nonprofit bought them, but they were run internally as cooperatives in terms of decision making, and each house had to maintain itself, and Madison Community Cooperative made sure that there was enough money set aside for reserves and all that, but the people who lived there didn't own it, so it wasn't a pure cooperative. It was owned by a nonprofit and run as a cooperative, and then house all had representation in the cooperative as well. So the way I got into it is that, well, you know, if you're going to buy up all this housing, you have to have money. And, you know, I looked in our checkbook, and literally there was a checkbook at the top drawer. Right. And at that time we were in the basement of a church, right, the St. Francis house. You know, pulled out the checkbook and there was like, you know, $23.15. Not going to buy much with this. You know, the dues were coming in, but they were never very much anyhow, which is why the pay was like $100 a month or something like that. And so I decided, well, we have to raise money. And so I didn't know anything about this. I went to the library and you know, started looking at books. And I found this one book that was about corporate bonds. And I thought, well, you know, we're a corporation. Let's see what it is. And I read it, didn't understand much of anything, but in the back, the appendix was the actual securities offering for the bond, you know, all the legalese and that sort of thing. And I thought, oh, this is how it's done. So I went back to the office and copied it and put our name in the place where it was, you know, called a board meeting and said, you know, the way corporations raise money is they sell bonds. You know, we have to find people to buy them, but you know, that's where your job comes in. Like all the board members should, you know, go out and sell bonds. And so just to tell you how long ago it was, there was a Xerox, there was a mimeograph, so we mimeographed. Everybody passed them out, and we started, you know, just to show how sophisticated the board was at that time. They all thought this was a great idea. You know, sell bonds, that's a great idea. And, you know, so they, you know, agreed to do it, and we had a little bit of money come in. I said, sell to your parents and your friends and you know, whoever you know, and you know, talk to a couple foundations, and so it got out there, and I was sitting at my desk about 3 days later, and the phone rings, and it's our attorney calling. And he said to me, Michael, I heard a rumor. I'm sure it's not true, but I'm going to run it by you anyhow. And I said, sure. He said, I heard that you were selling corporate bonds. And I said, well, that's not a rumor. That's true. And there was a long pause. At which point he said, Michael, you know, the state of Wisconsin has laws to protect its citizens from people like you. I thought, what do you mean? Like, what's wrong? He said, do you know what the term securities fraud means? And I said, well, I know what fraud means. What's a security? I have no idea. And he went on to explain to me that, you know, protections, and you have to register with the state, and you know, all this legal stuff. And I said, well, you know, I don't see why this would be illegal. I mean, we're doing what we said we're going to do with the money, and not only that, but you know, I run the numbers, and that works. I mean, we could buy the house that you know, we could buy the house next door to her, and it was one we were looking at actually, and people's rent would go down if we bought the house. It would actually cost less to live there, and that includes, you know, paying the operating costs and the taxes and all things like that. So, you know, we should be doing this, and you're our lawyer, so why don't you figure it out? Because there shouldn't be anything illegal about it. And so he did figure it out. I mean, what he figured out was basically what we even do with the loan fund today, which is, you know, we get loans from people, and it's not a security, although, you know, in some states maybe it is a security, but essentially it's people deciding to lend money, or other corporations or foundations lend money, which they did. They lent to Madison Community Cooperative, and in fact, we bought that house right next door. And in fact, I lived in that house the next year. And so that was, you know, really by accident that I got involved in the funding stuff, just because there was an opportunity there. And you know, I sort of regret, you know, the whole thing about, even when we look at housing today and all the work that the loan fund's done with manufactured housing. some of my early work was, I worked with Chuck Mathai, who was really the visionary in the field, and who I learned from initially. He ran an organization called the Institute for Community Economics. And the Institute for Community Economics is the organization that actually I was working with that helped found this organization that was modeled on the Institute for Community Economics loan fund at the time. And so it was really the opportunity to begin borrowing and begin to start a program that came from first at but Chuck Mathai, Institute for Community Economics. His initial funding and also from the loan funds was from the Sisters of Mercy, were the first lenders, and they were one of the first lenders to the Institute for Community Economics as well. And one of the things I remember Chuck saying, and it's still true today, was one of the big things that ICE funded was community land trusts. And his idea was, if you don't control the land, then you're going to lose all the property. And so his idea was that most community organizations had it all wrong when they thought about how they would get into affordable housing. And they had it all wrong because what they often did was promote their neighborhood as an up-and-coming neighborhood and a good neighborhood to live in and a place where outsiders wanted to invest, because he said, what would happen is they would succeed and then they would be displaced because those areas would become desirable. And so he said that the real strategy that you should undertake is you should say that your neighborhood is a terrible, rotten place to live, while you are, like the real estate developers, quietly buying up the land and putting it in trust for the neighborhood. So a lot of ICE's early work, and even the work around the manufactured housing here, was the idea of buying the land and controlling the price of the land, because that was what would maintain permanent affordability. And so if you did other stuff, you were just actually promoting your own demise. If you were building up the neighborhood but not having control of the land, if you were promoting it as a good place to live, you were promoting it for other people. And so that was my early learning, was from Chuck Mathai, really, and his ideas on land. And as you know, in the manufactured housing stuff now, people can't sell the land. They can sell their houses and they can make a profit on their houses, as you all know, but they can't collectively sell the land underneath it. Well, they can, but they can't make any money off of it. So they don't. There's no incentive to do that. And I think that's a really powerful part of the model.
Well, how did you end up back here starting the community loan fund? Or how did you go from organizing a co-op to becoming a lender?
Right. Well, I came to New Hampshire in 1981. I got a job at what was then New Hampshire College, now it's Southern New Hampshire University. And at that time started this master's program in community development, which was designed for adult practitioners, a program that is the similar program I brought with me when I came to UNH, is now at UNH, the master's program in community development policy and practice. And it was also working at ICE at the same time. So part of the strategy of ICE was, let's look at several different opportunities. Chuck Mathai's initial idea at Institute for Community Economics was the question of, should we, because we had a loan fund, and even in the early 80s at that time, we're up to, it seemed like an enormous amount of money then because it was so much bigger. I remember when we hit like $20 million in the early 80s, and it was like an unbelievable amount of money at that time, it seemed like. And so the question came up, should we grow into a really big national fund? I mean, we made loans nationally. I mean, we made loans in Massachusetts and Maine and Ohio and a couple other places. Or should we think of a strategy that would seed other funds? The idea that it'd be more powerful to have funds that serve different regions and probably do better. Chuck was little reluctant because Chuck always felt that once the power got out of the hands of the people who had the vision, that the vision would be compromised. And in fact, for example, he was against the creation of the CDFI fund, which is where we actually had a different opinion one of the few times we did. But he felt that once the government got involved as the primary funder of the type of work we were doing, they would have the ability to change the mission. That the mission would then become, how do we get money from the government as opposed to what's our program? I don't think that's become true, although I certainly see elements of it today, but I don't think it's changed the basic mission. I don't think, for example, that the community loan fund taking money from the federal government has changed the basic mission in any significant way. But he was afraid it would, and he was opposed to it. And I was one of the people who actually testified in front of the Senate Banking Committee in favor of the CDFI fund, and Chuck was against it. And it was really hard with Chuck against it because I admired so much his thinking and his ability to get things done. But he did go along with the strategy, and so the strategy of building out from ICE's model, there were 3 funds that were started at approximately the same time. New Hampshire Community Loan Fund, what was then the Boston Community Loan Fund, which has gone through several name changes, now Blue Hub, and Reinvestment Fund, with no V, Reinvestment Fund, which has also gone through several changes, but at the time was the Delaware Valley Community Reinvestment Fund, which served Philadelphia and the general area. And so all 3 were sort of like sister funds, started about the same time, talked to each other a lot. The directors, Julie Eads and Dick Jones in Boston and Jeremy Nowak, who passed away a few years ago, were the 3 founders of those organizations. We're very close to each other, and we're all on the initial board as well of what was then the, what was its original name? National Association of Community Development Loan. The founding of what's now OFN, by the way, in all the meetings and the hours we spent on that, the thing that took the most time, that we devoted the most discussion and argument and all that was, what should the name be? It's always about those things. When you think about it too, it's like, I've worked with several CDFIs that have merged over the last few years. And all the discussions about governance and all that, and like the biggest issue that's to be resolved is, when we all relocate in one place, will there be parking for me? Something that everybody here could relate to. I don't want to merge if I don't have a place to park. Nothing else matters.
Well, I asked you a question on our board retreat, and your answer was so good, I'm going to repeat the question.
It may be a different answer.
I'm going to keep asking until I get the answer I want. Tell me about your favorite loan that you made.
My favorite loan. Can you give me a hint? Oh, yes. Yeah. One of the first loans we made at the Institute for Community Economics was, and this was, it's almost embarrassing to say now because, I had gone back to graduate school. I'd taken a bunch of courses in finance because I was interested in it from my experience in Madison. But I had, no actual real experience except for, almost going to jail for securities fraud. Nothing until, I worked with Chuck. And at the time, ICE was really focused on the land issues, community land trusts, and agriculture as well, agricultural trusts. And Chuck thought we should do some lending, and so he said to me, we should start a loan fund. Why don't you do it? Why don't you come up with the initial? And that's when like Bonnie asked you a few years ago, can you send us our current policies and procedures? And they're like 597 pages. And I remember our first policies and procedures, this is no exaggeration, was like 6 pages. I couldn't think of anything else. It covered the entire world the possibilities of anything that, it's like you have a loan committee and there are this many people on it, and here's how they decide, and here's, underwriting criteria. That was like a page if you really stretched it. Make good loans. And so we started a fund. It was in 1980, and again, terribly unsophisticated in all this. We did primarily land trusts. We did loans in land trust loans in Maine, in Cincinnati, Ohio. They started a land trust, and there was a small land trust in Boston as well. But Chuck also wanted to do some business lending as well. One of the first requests we got was from New Hampshire. There was a group in Wilton called the Rural Education Center, which doesn't exist anymore. But they ran a lot of programs, and what they really pushed was local agriculture, organic growing, sell to the local community, and they ran primarily educational programs. And they decided that they wanted to start a business, and so they didn't have any money, and they wanted to start a yogurt business. And Chuck said, well, why don't you go up and talk to them? So I went up and talked to them, and I came back and I said, well, they have an interesting idea, but they don't even have a business plan. Like, they really don't know what they're doing. And he said, well then, why don't you go back and talk to them, and why don't you write the business plan? I said, all right. So I went back and talked to them, and they were really, it was two people, really motley couple. I mean, one guy was a really sort of unkempt guy with a degree in engineering, sort of wild hair and a beard, sort of like I looked. Come to think of it, and the other guy was, a smart guy, but didn't know anything about business. Neither of them ever run a business, and I liked them, but he didn't seem particularly impressive as a business person. So anyhow, we sat down and talked about it, and their big thing was everything had to be local. So they had a farm, as it turns out, and this became a problem later on. The farm they were just leasing. They didn't own anything. And their idea was, the guy who was an engineer, a guy named Samuel Kamen, he was going to build this yogurt machine, and he was going to do it out of like scrap metal and pieces of stuff that he found in a junkyard, essentially. And he had actually built a prototype for us to look at, and he made a batch, for me to taste. At the time, I didn't particularly like it. Didn't really want to taste it, but being from the Midwest originally, I didn't want to be impolite or anything. So it's important to be polite. Taste it. Anyhow, he mixed up a batch of yogurt, and they talked about the local market, but everything had to be, locally produced. So they're going to grow on the farm their own feed, and they had to own their own cows. And the cows, in order for the yogurt to taste right, had to eat what they grew on the farm, and so everything had to be, hyper local. And so we talked to them and talked about plans for where they would sell and who they would sell to, and how much money, and sort of backed into how much they could afford to borrow. And I came back and I wrote a business plan, again, like 7 pages. So the other guy who found it was Gary Hirschberg, who some of you might know. And this loan turned out to be a Stonyfield Farm yogurt, which is one of the first business loans that we made. But it was bizarre in a lot of ways. I mean, for the lenders here now, it's like, well, they didn't really own anything, and they didn't own the property. The machine was, had no resale value. I mean, the yogurt machine that they had at the time. Was like, I said to Chuck, this is a pretty risky loan. It's only $30,000, but we weren't that big at the time. $30,000 would have been a big loss. And was no collateral, no business experience, no track record, no sales.
You have to start somewhere, right?
And Chuck said, well, what do they own? And I said, they own this machine and about, and 6 cows. And he said, good, well, get collateral on those. Which was something I learned is, always take collateral even if the resale value is 0 just because of that. So one of my memories was, as I go back to the, to file the UCCs, the Uniform Commercial Code, for the lenders, the documents that give you collateral, and you file it at the county courthouse there. And I remember, yeah, it's coming. Fill out a form for a cow. And one of the things on the UCC form is, describe the piece of it. And there's a woman at the counter there, and I'm putting, well, her name is like Nellie. She has a big black spot on her right side. The woman looks at me and says, "Are you finding collateral on a cow?" And I said, "Yeah." She said, "Well, this is pretty unconventional, but there's no reason why we can't." So she signed off, and we had collateral on a cow. Actually, a couple of years later, I get a call from Gary on the phone. He says, "Michael, I have some good news for you and some bad news for you." And I said,
Trying to
"Well,
what to hear first.
what's the bad news?" He said, "One of your collaterals died." I said, "Oh, that's too bad." He said, "Where do you want her?" All I could think of was like, what my wife would say if there was a dead cow. This is a bad idea. You can keep her. I said, "What's the good news?" He said, "The good news is one of your others is pregnant." So anyhow, this is, lending in the early days. Pretty unconventional in that regard. So, you may not be surprised to learn that they did in fact repay the loan and moved on to better things than the loan.
You realize the corner you painted me into with our business and community team. You made a really sort of interesting comment earlier, about your conversations with Chuck and about national CDFIs and regional, statewide CDFIs and the hyper-local CDFIs. We've had a really different arc than the Reinvestment Fund, TRF, as well as Blue Hub, BCC. Do you have a sort of opinion on what's the right size for CDF? Does it make sense for them to be these large national organizations with massive balance sheets, or these hyper-local city-based CDFIs, or what we are, sort of the statewide organization? And one of my, a really interesting moment for me was hearing Julie speak on this, in San Antonio, I guess maybe 12 years ago, and her ideas very much affected my thinking. I'd like to get yours about what is besides the polite answer, there's a need for everything. What do you think about this issue of scale and size and reach versus impact? Where do you get so big that Chuck Toad spoke to you about declension, that we lose mission out of it once it gets out of the hands of the original founders. I mean, how do you balance, scale to have more impact with the risk of declension?
Yeah, I mean, that raises really a lot of questions, which is ranging from how many CDFIs should there be? I mean, right now there are over 1,300. Is that too many? Too few? How important is it that CDFIs be self-sustaining, that is, generate sufficient revenue from their activities to cover at least basic expenses to run the organization? I mean, there's a lot of discussion about this, because what that also means is that if you're relatively small, it's a much bigger challenge. interest and fees to sustain yourself. But should you be? Is that the goal, to be self-sustaining? And so what if you do have to raise money from other sources each year? The one about too small, and worked on a couple mergers, is if you have multiple CDFIs, all relatively small, all serving the same market, even if they have different products, is there an opportunity? I mean, one of the starting points when I work with CDFIs on even talking about the question of merger is to have them look at what would a combined balance sheet look like. If you put the three of you together, here's what your balance sheet would look like. Does this look good to you? Would this allow you to do more than what you're doing individually right now? What sort of compromises would have to be made? I think, the CDFI field or industry or movement, whatever you want to call it, is still really young. A lot of people trace it to, not when we were created, but to the creation of the CDFI fund. I mean, it really does. I mean, in some ways, Chuck was right. I mean, the CDFI fund is what has centered, in a lot of ways, the discussion around community development finance. But the question is, do we really need that many? And can that many be supported and self-sustaining? And what happens if the government does pull out? I mean, the last couple of years have been a real moment for CDFIs in terms of federal government programs and recognition. But, we still had a Donald Trump who every year zeroed out the CDFI fund, and just Congress put it back in and voted in favor of it. And in many ways, the field has done a good job of recruiting political support from both sides of the aisle, even though it's obviously seen as a Democratic initiative originally, and in many ways still its strongest supporters. And the question is, what should the field look like if the goal is to maximize access to capital for people who have been traditionally excluded, as opposed to a starting point of how many CDFIs should there be and are we self-sufficient on it? It's like, what's the best model to really create more opportunities for access to capital for people in communities that have traditionally been denied access? But it's hard to think about that when you work at a CDFI or when you work in the field, because what you want to know is your job secure? Is the organization well managed? And are we also serving our mission? But you're not thinking more broadly about the field itself and the best models for the field to really enhance the opportunities for the users of the funds, the borrowers who we would serve. So it's a tough question to answer. What's the right size? I mean, ideally, what we'd say, and I think what the loan fund board would like to see is that we have a self-sufficiency ratio that's as high as possible, as close to 100% as possible. Understanding that there are the vagaries of the economic system, and there can be more loan opportunities in some years than others, so there's some movement in terms of what you can expect from year to year, but in general, like to see the trend upwards towards an increasing self-sufficiency ratio, so that we're not dependent on donors. And it would be great. I mean, what if you didn't have to spend any time doing fundraising? Wouldn't that be great?
Yes.
Oh yeah. Looking at this side of the room, and hearing a strong yes. So it's hard to answer what's the right size for the field. My personal feelings, and and I've said this in some discussions and talks, there's real resistance, is there probably are too many. If you look at the field and you look beyond New Hampshire Community Loan Fund, there are a lot of really small CDFIs, say, that really struggle to exist from year to year and spend a lot of money just on, when you look at the end, the little money they have, they spend so much time just raising money, and then on compliance issues with the monies that they've raised, they have very little time to actually do lending and develop the market and work with potential borrowers. And you sort of wonder, is it really worth it for that? And there are a lot of things that can be done. I mean, one is larger CDFIs. I mean, in the studies that we've done too, what we found is larger CDFIs, particularly on almost every measure, perform better than smaller CDFIs. That is, they have higher deployment rates. That is, they get more of their money out in the field working faster. They generally have better performance measures in terms of delinquencies and defaults. To the extent that you can compare and measure impact measures, they generally have higher impact. If you define impact as how are people's lives better off, which is a difficult metric, but not impossible to measure. I mean, we have all sorts of proxy measures that we can use for that. I mean, something like if we're financing child care centers, we know that good comes from it. We don't have to follow those children's lives for 20 years and find out, did they turn out okay compared to, a randomly selected other group of children. It'd be great if those studies were done. I mean, to have that sort of rigor in it, but you can draw pretty strong conclusions from, if you're supporting child care centers, and we know from the data that early childhood intervention, educational intervention, actually makes a big difference in children's lives 20 years down the road. Then we don't have to follow them forever and compare it to them. So, I mean, there are ways of doing that, but the small CDFIs generally, and there are of course exceptions, don't perform as well as the larger ones. So should we encourage larger ones? And I think there's, in that case, less difference between a national one like LISC and a statewide one like the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund. There are arguments that can be made for both. I mean, LISC obviously doesn't serve a lot of local communities, whereas we do. If you look at where our loans are, they're in places that simply LISC would never be able to reach. I mean, we make loans in the North Country. There's no national organization that's going to make loans in the North Country of New Hampshire. So there's a
We definitely have a monopoly in Colebrook.
Yeah. Probably Berlin too.
Yes. Have it all ourselves. Would you call us large? Or if you had to define what a large CDFI was, just to put a number on it, just for, we have so many folks here that are new to CDFIs, just give us a sense of scale.
Right. Well, it's a really bifurcated field, meaning that there's a relatively small number of larger ones. So I'd say 100 million or more. So maybe of the 1,300, there may be 50 or so that are that size. I mean, I last looked a couple of years ago, probably more now, given all the money that's gone into the field. But what you're looking at is 5% of the field maybe that's 100 million or larger, and that could have any thought of being financially self-sustaining. And what that means is that there's some like 1,300 or so that are smaller than that, many of which really struggle to sustain themselves from year to year. And one of the things that I pushed for a long time for the CDFI fund, and I don't know if you've seen it, Steve or Bonnie, but there is this federal government interagency memo that came out where they're asking for feedback on all the different federal programs and how they could better serve community development finance. Because, I mean, so I'm writing a response to that, and the first thing I tried to do is identify all the federal programs that potentially have money available for CDFIs, and I'm at like 25 right now. And I bet we don't even know about, I didn't know about some of them until then, at like 5 different agencies. And one of the problems for small CDFIs is that we don't, in many ways, we don't think of ourselves as a field, we think of ourselves as individual CDFIs. And what that means is every CDFI invents its own operating system. What this means is, for small CDFIs, it's just really unmanageable. I mean, I have a very personal connection to someone who runs a small CDFI, my son, who runs a native CDFI, and it started out as the only person because they were on the brink of bankruptcy. And it's just, you know, an impossibly difficult job. I mean, in large part because of how difficult it is to work on a reservation and how challenging people's lives are there. But also just in terms of, you know, how much of his time is spent doing things that have nothing to do with making loans on the reservation or to people who are part of those tribes. So what I also see in small CDFIs is they really struggle. I mean, if you're a 3-person CDFI or even a 5-person CDFI, I mean, how do you deal with, you're dealing with your accounting and your audit. I mean, you're dealing like everybody on this side of the room. You have one person doing all of your jobs, right? You're raising money. You're the CFO. Maybe you have someone who comes in, once a month to help on that. But you're trying to train somebody to do just the basic accounting work. And you don't have time to do any loans. And you're the HR department as well. And there's no way you can possibly deal with all the HR problems, particularly given the fact that you're dealing with the fact that you're trying to hire all people who live on the reservation and all the issues that come up in terms of, lack of education and work experience and that sort of thing. And, so that's an extreme example, but it's a pretty common example with small CDFIs that you have to do with a relatively small group of people, everything. And as you know, if you get any federal money, the compliance issues are, just enormously time consuming. And not to mention applying for the funds each year and how time consuming that is. And you have to think, why doesn't the field do anything about that? I mean, I've talked to CDFI Fund a couple times and I'm doing it again, saying, you really need to invest in an operating platform for small CDFIs that a lot of companies have now. The best example, some of you may know, is I think incredibly impressive organization is CCA Global Partners. It's based in Manchester, which forms cooperative enterprises among retailers like bicycles, like 250 bicycle shops form a cooperative, and they have an operating platform run by CCA that does everything from their, marketing, financing, purchasing. They have an HR department, So essentially, that stuff's centralized. You can get on a platform. There's also support staff that support several hundred stores that can't do it on their own, and then they own it as a cooperative. They own the platform essentially. And we need something like that for the CDFI field, that standardizes the backroom stuff, that standardizes the stuff that everybody has to do, and frees up people's time to do what we're supposed to be doing, which is lending and providing technical assistance and training and building up our borrower base. But even if we look at the loan fund here and the people in this room, how much time do people in this room spend doing stuff that has nothing to do, that has everything to do with raising money and compliance, as opposed to people who are directly involved? And it's probably more people than we would want it to be. But that's sort of the reality of managing a fairly large fund. So we can do better as a field. The problem even is with CDFIs is most of them don't want the CDFI fund doing anything than giving money to individual CDFIs, because anything that's spent collectively is less money. So it means that our grant goes from $600,000 to $450,000 if we're supporting broader development of the field. If you ask a lot of people here, do we want to give up $150,000 for a platform that we probably wouldn't use? And the answer is, well, probably not. So it doesn't happen.
I have a question though, because I really like the idea around cooperative, like having a cooperative, that the small CDFIs can come together and work, so they can hire the HR person, they can hire people to train and teach the technical aspects. But I do also have a little concern when it comes to those communities that you just said on the reservation. And we know that the impact that we are talking about here, it's more supporting those in need. Even though it's small, and I don't know how much of impact they are making, and we know the needs are greater in that area than it is in Boston. If there is a CDFI in Boston, or if there is a CDFI, I don't know, in Philadelphia. So maybe trying to get that concern resolved based on the impact that it can make, more than looking at what is, I don't know, the funds that they have. Of course, it has to run on funds, but where the funds come from, you are talking about the government funds as well. So if they had the funds, they more impact compared to maybe if somebody is in Boston. So
Right.
that's where the,
Did you want to say something, Sarah?
No, just the criteria he's talking about how the funds are dispersed, right? You're talking about weighting criteria
The weighting
slightly
criteria-
differently, potentially.
and I think, yes, he built on it a little, but when Steve was asking, being too big or what we can make as an impact, and the example that he just gave about his son working on the conservation and how hard it is for those people living there. And maybe, even as I said earlier, the greater needs are there on the conservation land than it is in Boston. But CTFIs in Boston or even in Concord, New Hampshire, where we are sitting, is bigger than where the needs are even greater.
Right. Well, again, from the CDFI's fund's perspective, and this is probably a smart thing, is that it seems like one of their important decision-making points has to do with geographic diversity for political reasons. That is, if you want to get continued funding from the government, that's one of the problems is that you're subject to the annual budget process. So every year you have to worry about, is it going to be in the budget, is it going to be more or less, how would that translate into what we get? And so part of, the government agency is, if they're aware of the work that they're doing, they're going to say, well, we're going to make awards in as many congressional districts as we can, because when it comes around next year, we want their constituents to be able to go to their representatives and say, we got a grant, and we're in your congressional district, and this is the good that it did, and so you should support this program because it's actually helping people in your district. And so a lot of times, that geographical diversity is represented not because that represents the best applications or the greatest impact, but because it represents a certain degree of political wisdom in terms of being able to maintain your own existence.
So Chuck was right then, if we built based on that theory.
Yeah, well,
It's no doubt.
he was pretty much right about that.
So we've got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask you a really easy question to close out. One of the things that's why I'm looking at Jen, one of the things that I think she's used to hearing me say again and again is, let's stick to our knitting. We have this core activities that we're really good at, like let's stick to your knitting. But you've also heard me talk about in New Hampshire over the last 20 years, income inequality has doubled. The Community Loan Fund has an unquestioned, admirable legacy of creating affordable home ownership opportunities, and it's really a pioneer nationally. Yet affordable housing is harder to obtain than it's ever been. It sort of begs the question, do we as an institution, lending for us is a tool in the toolbox. It's not what we are. What we are is that we try to make the lives for people of low incomes better, because being poor is so damn expensive. Do we need to add other activities? And he's talking about us as a proxy for other CDFIs that are pretty strong. Do we need to do policy work? Do we need to become real estate developers? Do we need to do item D that I haven't listed? If we really want to have the impact and the legacy that our investors really demand of us.
Yeah, I mean, not to be flip in my answer, but the answer, you know, potentially the answer is yes to all of the above. And not all at once, and cautiously, and not just jumping wildly into it, but, you know, should we be developers? Maybe. Should we have partnerships with developers who we trust, where we more aggressively pursue the development process? Maybe. I'm not sure exactly what that would look like, but you know, it seems to be that there's a dearth of that. But it seems like, you know, partnerships around those issues, or you know, stronger partnerships with a credit union, for example, so that we're looking at you know, so when we look at the manufactured housing parks, do we even know how many people are unbanked or could use an account, or are using you know, consumer lending methods that are exploited? You know, so if we're looking broadly at issues of access to capital and financial services and the whole sort of financial sector, is there more we could do? And the answer is, yeah, there's always more that we could do. And the question is, you know, what are the priorities right now? But I would say, yeah, I mean, over time, as we have now, we want to expand what we do. And it's always up against, you know, what does it cost for us to do that? I mean, we did have, for a number of years, I don't know, Bonnie, you were here, I don't know who else was here. You were here, Kent, and which is, we had a micro-enterprise lending program here. And it's not that it did poorly, it was, my understanding, was just so expensive. I mean, the costs of making small loans, I mean, the information and transaction costs of making a $3,000 micro loan, were just, you know, we didn't have the money to do that. And it was taking away funds from other programs that we thought had more impact at the time. So, I mean, that's an example of something that we like to do, that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Bonnie, but I think we did pretty well.
We did.
But it was just so expensive. Is that right?
Yes, and the fundraising, the funding got harder and harder to get.
Yeah.
Fortunately, we've just submitted our application for the SBA microloan program. Where's Latanya? Who's going to have ownership of this?
But it has fundraising with it, it has grants.
It does. It has grants to support the headcount. It's one of the ironies is that it's probably cheaper to give someone $3,000 than to lend it to them and service it.
Well, that's actually one of the recommendations I'm making to this interagency task force, which is looking at this, is that what we really need is that we need an operating platform for CDFIs that navigates the government funding problem. Because there really are, I was looking at the list that I had to put together, there's no list anywhere else. And I'll send you my response when I write it, like, well, it's due Monday, so I have a draft. But essentially listing, you know, close to 20 different programs that CDF, including like 4 different ones at SBA and rural development and commerce and treasury and HUD and you know, so there's 5 agencies right there. Well, actually SBA is part of commerce, but different programs within commerce even. And what they really need is one standard application to all of them. And what they also need is a platform where you put in what you do or what you want to do, and then it automatically applies to those programs that you would qualify for. This is, you know, it's not that complicated a computer programming problem. It's more a political problem than anything else. But if you want to, you know, cut the fundraising, staffing time significantly, and you want to maximize the financial resources that are available anyhow, it wouldn't be that difficult to do something like that. So that's, you know, one of the big recommendations is you know, standardize the application and have it that when you apply, you put in what the problem that you're trying to solve, and it then applies to all of those programs at once, and then it informs you which ones the application's been submitted to for which of the particular products or issues or problems you're trying to solve.
I'll let Jeremy and Lori get on it. I know you're on a short clock, so no eating lunch today. So what are we going to say?
DOT, actually, it might be a good example for you to use. DOT, the federal DOT, just launched the Community Navigator program, and it's exactly that, but it's by geography because it's a community. It's a zip code base. That you put it in, it gives you all the programs, especially with all the new funding that you're eligible for. It also then gives you ambassadors to help you walk through the program. And it standardizes applications. They just launched it.
Is it just for DOT then?
It's just for transportation-related programs, but it is an example of them actually, like, it's not that hard, right?
Right. And we can identify all the programs, getting one application.
And it's national, and it's meant to help the smaller organizations, like the smaller cities that don't have 100 staff, right? So it's a transferable idea.
Right.
If somebody will get out of the way to do it.
And the ambassador's idea is a good one too. And there's there's a technical assistance line and people who are responsible for understanding the navigation of the whole system.
Yeah, it does have some streamlined applications.
But it would have to, again, what I'm talking about is cross-agency, which I think is.
And this does do that to some extent, but it's limited. It's crossing into HUD, and it does cross into some programs, some EPA, especially because of the new money. But I'm not sure that they're guaranteeing you that you get ambassadors from across agencies.
Yeah.
It's just an example.
Well, I want to thank you for, first, I am so happy you're not sitting first chair in an orchestra somewhere. You allowed us all to have meaningful work and certainly made New Hampshire much better. I want to thank you for coming, and everybody thank Michael for... Two board members joining us. Shalimar and Ollie, could you stand up, please? Hi, Shalimar and Conrad. Thank you all for joining us today.
Well, thank all of you as well. And it's always great to get credit for something that you didn't really but I really appreciate that. The work you do is terrific, and you should know that the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund is really one of the best in the country. It really is. And so, what a great job you do.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.